We are back, and we are joined now by John Carl Baker, Deputy Director of Programs at Ploughshares, foreign policy writer in many publications, including your latest in The Nation entitled South Korean Protesters Thwarted More Than Just a Coup Attempt. John Carl, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to be here.
So, can you just give us basically a breakdown of what happened earlier this week on Tuesday? You know, President Yoon of South Korea, he declared emergency martial law. I was seeing it was the first time since 1979. It shut down the National Assembly, but he ended up being thwarted in this effort.
Yes, it was a pretty short-lived attempt at seizing power. But basically what happened is that on Tuesday night, Yoon made a big announcement that he was instituting emergency martial law. And then he sent soldiers to the National Assembly, possibly to arrest any legislators who happened to be there. There were, you probably saw videos online of tanks rolling through the streets or some kind of military troop transport rolling through the streets of Seoul. There were helicopters circling around. And then there were police blocking the way into the National Assembly and trying to keep legislators out because Yoon does not have support in the National Assembly. It's very much opposed to him. And all they really had to do, which is what they ended up doing, is hold a vote to rescind his order and end martial law. So it was a very stunning set of hours. It began and was really shocking for people, but really in only a few hours, the whole attempt had failed. And one of the big reasons that it failed is that as soon as it happened, South Koreans understandably were extremely shocked. And they have a robust, kind of democratic history. They've, thrown out presidents in recent years, and they themselves struggled against dictatorship for many years. So they took action, headed to the National Assembly, and called for legislators to enter. And then in some cases, they actually helped them enter the assembly. And eventually, legislators got in there, took a vote, and rescinded the order, and Yoon had to stand down. So it's a real victory for not just usual democratic processes, which is, I think, the way that it's kind of being celebrated by a lot of governments, but it's a real victory for mass democracy in South Korea, which has a really robust tradition of it.
And of course, these are the kinds of things where you see this and you go, gosh, could the United States have learned their lesson and thrown out the people that attempted to overthrow the democratic results of the 2020 election? But what do you know? We just reelected that guy for a second term. But I mean, so it's a 300-member National Assembly. I saw that basically they voted 190-0 to rescind martial law. He apparently controls 108 out of Yoon does out of the 300 members of that National Assembly. The that's obviously 190-0 out of 300. That means 110 members didn't vote. Can you explain that dynamic to us?
Sure, yeah. And a lot of this is still in play right now. We're still figuring out exactly what's going on. There were some conservative supporters who did actually vote against him, but not all of them voted. And, I think really what this says is that the South Korean Conservative Party still has not really escaped the legacy of the dictatorship. I mean, the last conservative president, Park Geun-hye, faced a huge scandal and ultimately, massive protests in the streets that led to her being removed. And during those protests, when she was really embattled in office, there was real risk of the military being used for her to seize power. And it's pretty shocking that we're here yet again in South Korea with the Conservative Party flirting with military dictatorship. And, I think it's alarming that more conservative legislators, haven't been willing to speak out about what happened. I'm glad some of them did. But it's a very partisan environment in South Korea, much like here. And it's perhaps not surprising that you do see people still defending Yoon, or at least kind of not rebuking him. But unfortunately, that means that they're justifying his actions, which was clearly an attempt to seize power in some sort of self coup or whatever you want to call it. And that is very alarming.
Right. And can you speak a little bit more about the history of dictatorship and conservatives in South Korea, the United States' role as well in, obviously the Korean War and the partition, and what basically that engendered in terms of the political system that you can still see today?
Yeah, well, it's a very long story. And, the U.S. has really been involved in a variety of ways for many, many years. But I mean, a lot of this goes back to the Japanese occupation. Starting in 1910, it was a 35-year occupation until the Japanese Empire lost World War II. And when Japan occupied Korea, it didn't just, send Japanese folks over to control everything. They worked with some indigenous Koreans to institute their imperial regime.
Yep.
And
which included obviously enslaving women for sexual purposes. It's a really disturbing history. Yeah,
it's a brutal occupation, and the thing about it is that this is not ancient history. I think a lot of people in the United States and elsewhere just think this is like, why can't they get over this?
Right.
Why are they still so up in arms about Japan? But people who were victims of the imperial regime are still alive and seeking justice. I mean, that's why it's a very live issue. So anyway, they worked with some Koreans who were basically imperial collaborators. And it's not surprising that the people who were willing to work with the Japanese Empire were conservatives, right-wingers in South Korea. And also people who represented, industry, capital. And basically that didn't just go away after the end of World War II. Some of those same people continued on in government. They continued on in the political system. And the roots of South Korean conservatism really do go back to that period. And so you have this history of dictatorship, as you mentioned. South Korea had a very shaky history anyway after it was liberated from Japan. But it did go through at least two very intense periods of outright dictatorship. And that was Doo-hwan in the 1980s, 1980 to 1988, and Park Geun-hye from 1962 to 1979. I mean, that is a long period of outright dictatorship. And it's worth noting that I mentioned Park Geun-hye earlier, who was thrown out of office thanks to the Candlelight Revolution. She is the daughter of one of these dictators. So it's a very real, very live history that connects South Korean conservatism with military dictatorship.
And in terms of Yoon specifically, can you talk a little bit about his record over these past years since he's been in power, and how it led to this particular moment in which he tried to seize power in this way?
Well, I think the most important thing for people to know about this is that he was elected in a very, very tight election. It basically squeaked through. And he's never had support in the National Assembly. So it's very hard to make policy and pass legislation when the unicameral South Korean legislature doesn't agree with you. And
why was he reelected then? If there's that schism, I mean, between the members of the parliamentary body, where he has so few allies, and yet he still got reelected just recently.
I think it's hard to say exactly what the reason was. I mean, I think there were some reasons that people were unhappy with the previous liberal government. In general, it ended up being a lot more popular than Yoon.
Yeah.
But there were periods of time, particularly at the end, where there were some scandals and controversy. And so it's understandable why people might vote for a change. But it didn't extend to the assembly. And just earlier this year, they had another election, and the opposition won even more seats in the assembly. So Yoon has really not been able to do a whole lot. And unfortunately, the flip side of not being able to accomplish a lot is that he's been faced with scandals. He's said and done things that have angered people. There's been concerns about corruption, and he's been extremely unpopular. This is the thing that I think is so fascinating about the fact that the U.S. hung many of its hopes and dreams on this petty, tyrant, is that the guy didn't have popular support in South Korea, and he basically hasn't had support the entire presidency.
I mean, that's never stopped the United States before, so I guess I'm not that shocked.
Well, it's a fair point. It's a fair point. But, one would think if they really had these long-term strategic designs, they might think about the risks of associating themselves with someone like Yoon, especially in South Korea, which has such a robust democratic civil society and really just does not suffer the risk of dictatorship at all. So it was a real mistake, I think, on their part to do what they did and become so associated with Yoon.
And I read that he's used his veto power like many, many times in a way that is almost unprecedented. And there were some allegations about his wife and corruption there. Can some of those examples, if you don't mind, just giving people some context?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, he has vetoed quite a bit. Some of these have involved the assembly attempting to investigate, him and people around him, and so he has stopped actions like that. His wife, the First Lady of South Korea, was caught on video accepting a gift, a very expensive purse, and this was a huge controversy in South Korea.
Which purse?
I think it was Christian Dior.
Okay, interesting. Right. I was hoping for a Birkin, but anyway, keep going.
Yeah, I believe that's right. Not up on my high fashion purses.
Okay.
But I think that the actual event itself was maybe a fairly minor scandal when you stack it up to other things, but it was such a perfect illustration, I think, of the fact that the populace saw the Yoon administration as corrupt, as out of touch, and as doing things that most South Koreans just didn't want. And so it's really not a surprise that not only were people shocked when he tried to institute martial law, but that they took to the streets to stop this, because this is not a presidency with a lot of support in South Korea.
So where do they go from here? Is impeachment, is removal on the table? What has happened since Tuesday in that front?
Well, as I understand it, they have begun the impeachment process. It is very likely that he will be impeached. There's been speculation that he might run. I've seen people talk about him fleeing from the country. We don't really know. It seems like what's going on right now among people in his administration and maybe among the Conservative Party is they're trying to maybe find other places, other points of blame other than Yoon, which is an interesting strategy. I don't think that's going to work. It appears, I think, that his defense minister was one of the people who was very much responsible for the declaration. And so there's been some speculation that maybe they're trying to blame him instead of the president who implemented it. I do not think that's going to work. So yeah, it's very likely that he will be impeached or removed from office, that he will preempt the situation somehow by trying to flee or resign. But yeah, his presidency is over. There's no future here.
And in terms of his presidency, I know that there have been budget cuts. I don't know if it's fair to describe it as austerity, but what has he accomplished, and what has been the reaction from the South Korean public? Are those actions in and of themselves very unpopular, or is he kind of just an unpopular figure, or is it a blend of both?
I mean, I think it's a variety of things, but if it helps to illustrate this, I mean, he has said pretty wild pro-capital things, even when he was running for election. There was a big controversy because he, at one point, when he was running for office, said that people should be allowed to have 120-hour work weeks, which is a pretty wild claim. And as you can imagine, one that does not go over well in South Korea, which has a lot of very powerful trade unions. And so it gives you an
I just
example.
168 hours in a week. So yeah, that's not acceptable. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
keep going.
And it was the response to the opposition floating a proposal to basically establish a set of maximum hours. So he was sort of saying, like, there shouldn't be maximum hours. You should be able to work as much as you want. But his, he's a South Korean conservative, and while South Korean conservatism is kind of defined by opposition to the North, it does have a lot of similarities economically with what we would think of as kind of classic conservative governance here in the United States. So yeah, support for big business, austerity measures. I mean, these are things that, there are South Korean conservatives obviously in the country, and his party, the PPP, does have some base of support. But you can imagine this is very controversial. And not only does the opposition dislike it, but the robust civil society that South Korea has, which, like I said, is very much bound up with the power of trade unions and labor organizations like that, they're not going to stand for something. And that's part for this sort of proposal. And that's part of the reason why Yoon has been so controversial.
Can you speak a little bit about his militarism and the fact that he partnered with Biden on this AUKUS agreement, which basically was a way to put submarines and other, I don't know if they're nuclear capable, but basically armaments in China's backyard. And it seems as though Yoon was very willing to go along with this kind of militaristic approach that the Biden administration has pursued as it relates to China.
Sure, yeah. Well, they're two separate things, but they are related, and they need to be understood in tandem. AUKUS is an agreement, U.S., Australia, UK, and it involves, getting attack submarines basically to Australia so that they can patrol the Pacific. What the Biden administration has been doing in South Korea is to try to foster what's called trilateral security cooperation between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. Now, they're two different, things, but both of them are aimed at the same country, which is China. The U.S. is a little cagey about outright declaring that. This was certainly true with AUKUS, where they didn't outright say, we want Australia to have attack submarines in the Pacific because we want to change Chinese power. But that's clearly what it was, aimed at. And the trilateral agreements in Northeast Asia are the same thing. I mean, these are ostensibly aimed at deterring North Korea, which is clearly on South Korea and Japan's doorstep. But it would be very foolhardy to think that is the extent of it. This is about creating an anti-China bloc in Northeast Asia, and Yoon was willing to go along with it. I mean, the United States partnered with him because, in general, South Korean conservatives tend to align with the U.S. on foreign policy. He's certainly very anti-North, as South Korean conservatives tend to be. And that's part of the reason, I think, if you wanted an explanation for the quandary I was exposing earlier about why the U.S. got in bed with this guy, the truth is that they did because it was an opportunity they had. I mean, when he won that razor-sharp election, this was their chance, because the liberals and others in South Korea have a quite different approach to relations with China. It's not that they're pro-China or anti-US for that matter, but they want to preserve some degree of autonomy, right? They want a real partnership with the US. South Korea is a US ally, and they take that allyship very seriously, and that they want an equal partnership. What they don't want, and arguably what Yoon did, is basically to just go along with whatever the US says. Right. And that involves, pushing back against China as part of the U.S. plans, and particularly Joe Biden's plans for great power competition. And so the U.S. kind of had to go along with Yoon because this was their opportunity to implement things that they've wanted to do for a very long time. People who are China hawks, but also just, North Korea hawks and have positions like that. They have wanted greater trilateral cooperation between those states for a long time. And so the U.S. had to seize the opportunity. What's funny about this, of course, is that the window dressing for this whole agreement was that the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, and Biden, Yoon, and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida were out there defending democracy in Northeast Asia. I mean, they positioned this as them defending, they said they had shared democratic values. And like I said in the piece, not even a year and a half later, after they all went to Camp David and declared this, Yoon tried to seize power in a coup. Right. And it shows you just how shallow that democratic commitment really is from him.
Yes, I mean, honestly, and it just relates to so much of foreign policy over the past 4 years under the Biden administration. The declarations about democracy are so patently absurd given the regimes that they support, whether it be they're saying we want to promote democracy in the Middle East by imposing the authority that we want to rule over the Palestinians, and we're also going to work with MBS and Sisi and these autocrats. And I mean, I guess this is such a big picture kind of foreign policy point, and I'll wrap with you here, John Carl, but just that whole notion, I mean, it spreads even into our relations in Asia. We are not supporting democracies or democratic leaders in any way. I'd be hard pressed to think off the top of my head of which democratic leader is at the forefront of our foreign policy decisions right now. It's actually anti-democracy while they tell us it's democracy.
That is a fair assessment. And I think the thing to know about this is that great power competition is about raw power politics. This isn't about values. It's about the U.S. seeing China as a threat and doing what it can to try to check Chinese power. And the U.S. is willing to, partner with whoever it can partner with to try to stop what it views as the rise of China and retain the United States position as world hegemon. That's what this is about. It has very little to do with democracy promotion.
Well, really appreciate your time today and giving us some context on this. John Carl Baker, Deputy Director of, sorry, I just lost in my notes, Deputy Director of Programs at Ploughshares, foreign policy writer, and the latest in the nation is entitled South Korean Protesters Thwarted More Than Just a Coup Attempt. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.